Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Star Wars novel review. This one's going to be for Star Wars Thrawn Treason, the third book in this kind of new Thrawn trilogy. But I think we pretty much know there is going to be more books in this, so it's not just a trilogy. But for now, there are three of them. And yeah, so you'll know prior to this book, I really liked the original Thrawn book, just called Thrawn. That came out a few years ago, and that I enjoyed, but had some issues with the second book, Thrawn Alliances. It definitely benefited from the fact that it had, some Clone Wars stuff in it, of the flashbacks with Thrawn meeting Anakin, and then the benefit in the present day stuff of it being very heavy on the Thrawn-Vader interaction. And then the big thing coming out of Alliances was pretty much the tease of this new species from the unknown sector, the unknown region, the Grisks, and that they are this looming threat that is eventually going to become a big enough threat to the Empire that they can't just be focused on the rebels or their projects. They also have to keep an eye out on the unknown regions, because if they don't, they could get very heavily surprised and be fighting a battle from multiple fronts. That was the setup from Alliances, that Thrawn kind of had managed to convince Vader that the Grisks were a decent threat. This book is kind of more of that. I think in the big takeaway moments, that's kind of what it's about. The Chiss come back into play, which means Eli Vanto comes back as a character, and he's obviously part of the Chiss military now, so the Chiss become a bigger kind of part here, which allows for more discussion, allows for more content to cover the idea of how loyal is Thrawn to the Chiss versus how loyal is he to the Empire, and how does he sort of deal with interacting with both sides. The big thing that he seems to be focused on is that he knows that the Grisks are a threat that need to be dealt with. So how does he help the Chiss that are there directly dealing with the Grisks, while also sort of helping out the Empire with their problems when they're, like, from the higher ups, they're not quite buying into how big of a threat the Grisks actually are. And that's what you get here. The premise for this book going in is basically Thrawn has his TIE Defender project that he wants more funding for, because he feels it will be the thing to really just, take out the rebels. If we mass produce the TIE Defenders, basically they'll be unstoppable because of how powerful those ships are with the hyperdrives and the shielding. Whereas Director Krennic, who's the other guy with a big project, wants all the funding directed to Project Stardust, which is the Death Star. And so you get this sort of political battle here. And obviously we know, as tactical, brilliant, logical as Thrawn is, his one weakness is kind of dealing with these kind of political type situations. People seem to be somewhat easily able to manipulate Thrawn in some of these political situations. Obviously, when it comes down to the execution of them, he's able to tactically maybe get his way out of them, but he's not really able to immediately sense that he's in a sort of political battle where he needs to stand his ground. And so early on in the book, this is kind of where the setup comes in, of like, there's problems with Project Stardust. The supply lines are sort of struggling a bit. Supplies are going missing and getting lost. There's some sort of a security breach that needs to be solved, and that's why it needs more funding. So they come up with a kind of compromise of like, okay, Thrawn, here's the situation. If you, in about 10 days, within like a week or 10 days, I can't remember exactly which one it is, can solve the problem with Project Stardust, you'll get your funding. If you don't solve it in 10 days, the funding that was originally for your TIE Defender project will go to Project Stardust. And the idea here is that Thrawn really should have refused this. This isn't the sort of game he should have got himself involved in, but he's so, I suppose, focused on the challenge in a way that he let himself get kind of put into a situation that was kind of more negative than good for him. So the situation here is that Krennic, of course, wants the funding, but he also wants Thrawn's help with this supply problem. So he basically sends out his assistant director, Ronan, who's his right-hand man, to follow Thrawn as he goes through his kind of process of dealing with whatever problem it is. And the idea that with Ronan is that he's meant to be there to sort of delay Thrawn in doing what he's doing. He wants Thrawn to solve the problem, but in a larger amount of time, basically, so that the deal that they have will fail, but he'll get the benefit out of it. So he'll get the funding, but also the benefit of Thrawn helping his project. And that's the basic kind of premise of where we start off here, of Thrawn investigating what's going wrong with the Stardust supply lines, the Death Star supply lines. And then on the side story, the kind of subplot that eventually comes together, you have the return of the Chiss ascendancy. So Eli Vanto, who of course is Thrawn's protege from the first book, who he sent off to join the Chiss at the end, who was kind of missing from Alliance. And now here at the start, we find out that actually most people in the Empire assume that like Eli kind of deserted the Empire. Like that's how kind of like unclear Thrawn has been about where Eli actually went. But we find out that Eli is just, he has a rank within the Chiss military now, and even though he comes back to the Empire kind of here, he meets up with Thrawn again, he is still part of the Chiss Empire by the end of this. And it's kind of like, what is Thrawn's plan in all of this? Like, Eli is there for a reason, as we see. But throughout a lot of this book with Eli, you're kind of wondering, like, he's not particularly enjoying his position with the Chiss ascendancy, because he's like the only human on the ship. He's been given a somewhat kind of menial task. He doesn't have as high of a rank there as he did with the Empire. He's kind of a bit like, I'm kind of being wasted here. What's going on? But as we see, the Chiss commander, who is Admiral Arolani, actually over the course of this book begins to see the benefit of Eli, and that he's learned a lot from Thrawn and can be a benefit to her. And the idea here is that the Chiss discover more Grisk on the way, basically sort of a war fleet on their way to deal some pretty heavy damage to like the Chiss homeworld, and they have to intercept them. But it's just one Chiss kind of capital ship against a whole, like, it's not a huge fleet of Grisk, but it's like a battle group, and they need to deal with this now. So what ends up happening is that Thrawn's Chimera, his Star Destroyer, kind of comes into contact with Arlani's ship, and they end up sort of having to work together. And of course, Thrawn is still working on his Empire-specific project here of trying to help Krennic and Violet bit the supply lines, but then he's also kind of very, very interested in what's going on with the Grisks and so on. And the stories end up sort of overlapping a little bit, but are still fundamentally separate, in that the way it ends up kind of getting resolved is that the reason the book is called Thrawn Treason is because it's actually a traitor in the Imperial ranks that is causing funds and resources to be directed away from Project Stardust. And it turns out it's one of the other Grand Admirals. It's not Thrawn, it's not Krennic doing something weird, it's one of the other ones. And you get his reasoning for why he did this, and Thrawn eventually figuring all of this out. And that leads to, as we come to the final sequence of the book, these pretty cool two battles that happen. One of which is basically Thrawn outing this Grand Admiral as being the traitor, while Commander Pharaoh, who's Thrawn's new protege back on the Chimera, is basically executing all of Thrawn's orders effectively to deal with this guy trying to basically fight his way out of this situation. And you see Thrawn just completely outmaneuver this other Grand Admiral, and eventually, find out who the traitor is, kind of wins the day on that side of things. And they quickly rush to get involved in the battle that's happening between the Chiss and the Grisk. And I think if there's any problem with the book, it's probably that, like, I would have liked to have seen more interaction between Thrawn and Eli. But at the same time, I can also appreciate that a large part of like the whole protege kind of angle is done at this point between those two, and it is more about Pharaoh at this point learning from Thrawn rather than Eli needing to do that. He is sort of in a position where he can now fulfill his potential, and he doesn't need Thrawn to sort of teach him anymore, whereas that was more on Pharaoh over the course of this book to do, which I did actually really like. I think Pharaoh really became highlighted in this book as being a pretty interesting character. She gets a big promotion at the end of this book, and the idea is that Thrawn is really turning some of his kind of major officers into very important commanders within the Empire, and like they're sort of overlooking him a little bit. Of course, he has a really high position, Thrawn, but a lot of the other high ups do sort of overlook him. They just think of him as like the alien commander that's a bit weird. None of them believe some of his tactics, but he's giving amazing results for the Empire, and you're seeing that with how good Eli is and how good Pharaoh is. He's able to solve this issue without any Imperial dying in this, which seemed crazy at a certain point. That like it seems like it's going to be like borderline civil war of like this commander, the traitor commander, trying to fight these other ships as part of the Empire, and somehow Thrawn manages to completely counteract all of this guy's plans. But I think the big takeaway from this book is definitely the Grisks and the setup of them as the looming threat even more, along with the Grisk kind of Chiss dynamic, in that this is pretty much our first proper introduction to more of like the Chiss kind of what they're about. In that, of course, through Arlani and the navigators on her ship, you get to actually see more Chiss characters who aren't Thrawn, and see that like they're not all like Thrawn, but that species Chiss does actually have a kind of unique dynamic to it, and you kind of learn why Eli is part of this and what they need him for, in terms of the thing Thrawn is trying to do to help the Chiss, and you're seeing this kind of connection form of like the Chiss can benefit from allying themselves with the Empire, and the Empire can benefit from allying themselves with the Chiss. That's the kind of role Thrawn is playing, as everyone sort of questions like, is he a traitor to the Empire because he will ultimately support the Chiss? But it's more like, no, like in a way Thrawn positions himself where, in a way, both the Chiss and the Empire would probably both see him as a traitor to either side, because he's not fully allied with one side or the other. But he's creating a situation where they can both benefit each other, because the Empire clearly doesn't have the time to focus 100% on the Grisks, and then the Chiss don't have the, just, I suppose, supplies, basically, the manpower, full stop, to deal with the Grisks. So by both sides helping each other, the Empire gains a new ally they didn't have before, and the Chiss gain some support against the Grisks. The only criticism I'd have is that I still think it's a very basic, introductory level kind of approach to the Grisk just yet. I still feel like I don't have the best kind of grip on what they're about, what they are, because I like the idea. I like the idea of the lingering threat, this species that's sort of unknown to so many people. Their technology is very different and unique, and they seem they're set up as like the enemies of the Chiss. I think it's really cool, and it's very clearly set up for the future that we'll come back to this, and it's going to be this kind of bigger plot point that we never really knew about before. Like that could lead into kind of questions like, is this perhaps why the rebels were able to kind of get one over on the Empire, that they had one eye on the unknown territories, and stuff like that, which to me is more of like this book kind of being, it's good for the setup for the future rather than being this like amazing book by itself. This book, Thrawn Treason, I don't think quite has the importance of content that like obviously a book like say Darth Plagueis does, where you can just immediately be like, every Star Wars fan should read this book, that's how important it is. Whereas this one, it's more like, there's some teases, but it's more like set up for what I assume is going to be a very impactful fourth Thrawn book, which I assume is going to have to be set post-Rebels. It's going to have to cover where Thrawn and Ezra are as of the end of like the last season of Rebels, last episode of Rebels, because we're right there. As of the end of this book, we're basically, Thrawn is heading into that battle that is the finale of Rebels. So there's no time at this point for these books to go back or tell a story in between. The next book is going to have to be afterwards. which I think is going to be very cool because Thrawn now has this whole plot from the books here of like, how does he deal with the Grisks and stuff like that. But then from Rebels, you just know that he was defeated by the Rebels and he's off in space now. And I'd like to know how they connect the dots there, in that they can suddenly bring Sabine, Ahsoka, and Ezra into the Grisk unknown territory Chiss plot, and that could be really, really cool. So that's where I'd ultimately stand on this book. It's solid for what it does, the politics, Thrawn is a great character, but it's more of a setup for what happens next. So that's been the review. Thanks for watching, and bye.